Flight 782 had just lifted off the runway, rising into the early morning sky with the smooth confidence of a routine commercial flight, when the first unexpected jolt rippled through the cabin. At first it felt like a minor bump, something most passengers wouldn't think twice about, but within seconds the turbulence intensified, shaking the entire aircraft as if it had been caught in fist of a raging storm. Overhead compartments rattled violently, plastic panels trembled, and the faint hum of the engines was drowned out by gasps, startled cries, and the metallic groaning of the aircraft struggling against the sudden change in weather. Passengers clutched their armrests, gripping so tight their knuckles turned pale. A mother pulled her child closer, a businessman froze mid-sip with his coffee splashing onto his shirt, and a teenager tried to hide her fear behind a forced smile. The flight attendants attempted to stay calm, but even they exchanged uneasy glances as the lights flickered, not once, but twice, casting the cabin in momentary darkness before the emergency backup lighting steadied the glow. Among the crowd, unnoticed in all the commotion, sat a quiet 17-year-old girl named Maya. Her long hair fell over her face as she leaned against the window seat, lost in whatever music pulsed through her headphones. She had boarded quietly, spoken to no one, and carried herself with the kind of invisible presence that made her blend perfectly into the background. Anyone who looked at her would have assumed she was just another teenager traveling alone, maybe visiting family, maybe returning from school, maybe escaping something she wasn't ready to talk about. She had the look of someone used to silence, someone who didn't seek attention and didn't want to be seen. Even as the turbulence grew more violent, she simply removed one earbud, listened for a moment, and then went back to her music, assuming like everyone else that the pilots would regain control soon. But Maya's calm began to fade when she noticed the subtle shift in the flight attendants' expressions, a tightness around the eyes, a forced steadiness in their voices, and a hesitation in their movements as if they were waiting for instructions that weren't coming. The shaking worsened enough to make loose items slide across tray tables. A few passengers cried out as a sharp drop pulled their stomachs upward, the plane dipping so suddenly that even seasoned frequent flyers gasped. And then, slicing through the chaos, the cockpit door clicked open. Slowly, unsteadily, it swung outward and the captain stumbled into the aisle. His face was a pale, sickly shade, beads of sweat dripping down his temple, his breathing fast and uneven. One of the flight attendants rushed toward him immediately, but he lifted a trembling hand as if to stop her from panicking. His voice was hoarse, cracking around the edges, yet loud enough for the closest passengers to hear, and in seconds, word spread like wildfire through the cabin. "Both pilots are unconscious," he managed to say, gripping the doorframe to keep himself from collapsing. We need someone, anyone who can communicate with air traffic control or military command. Right now." The reaction was instant. Panic erupted like a burst dam. People rose from their seats. Someone screamed. A baby began wailing. A man in the back yelled for oxygen masks even though they hadn't deployed. The entire cabin dissolved into chaos, a swirling mass of fear and confusion. The turbulence continued to shake the aircraft, and without pilots at the controls, the plane drifted, climbing too steeply one moment and tilting dangerously the next. The captain tried to continue speaking, but his knees buckled and he sank to the floor, barely conscious. Flight attendants knelt beside him, shouting orders to each other, trying to maintain order, but the fear was uncontrollable because everyone on board suddenly understood they were inside a plane with no one flying it. And yet through all the noise, all the screaming, all the trembling metal and shaking seats, one quiet voice inside Maya's head whispered the same thing over and over: "You know what to do." She could feel her heart racing, pounding so hard it echoed in her ears louder than her music. Her hands shook, whether from fear or adrenaline, she couldn't tell, but something deeper pushed through the fear. Something she had trained for, something she had practiced countless times, sitting alone in her room or inside simulation labs during the aviation cadet program she never talked about. The program she had left without telling anyone on this plane, the program where instructors once told her she had a gift for communication and crisis response. The program where she had been the youngest and most unexpectedly brilliant voice they had ever heard. Maya swallowed hard and looked around. People were panicking, no one was listening, no one was stepping forward. The flight attendants were overwhelmed, the captain was barely conscious, and the plane, judging by the slight nose-down tilt, was losing altitude. She could feel it in her chest, the subtle pressure change in her ears, the way the engines strained unevenly. She knew this wasn't just turbulence anymore. This was danger, real, immediate, life-threatening danger. Her breath hitched, her pulse quickened, her palms felt cold. She had always hated attention, she had always preferred the background. But in that moment, none of that mattered. She was the only one with the training, the only one who could communicate clearly with air traffic control, the only one who could follow emergency instructions, the only one who could buy them time until help arrived. Slowly, almost painfully slow, Maya lifted her hand. At first, no one noticed. Her hand trembled in the air, small and almost invisible among the chaos. But then a flight attendant turned, eyes wide and frantic, searching desperately for any sign of help. She saw the raised hand. She froze. For a second she seemed confused. What could a teenage girl possibly offer at a moment like this? But there was something in Maya's eyes, not fear, not panic, something steady, something controlled. Something she didn't expect to see in someone so young. The flight attendant whispered, stepping toward her. Can you help? Maya nodded, her voice soft at first but steady enough. I can talk to them. I know how. And just like that, no one had noticed the girl who had boarded quietly and disappeared into her music, the girl whom everyone assumed was just another passenger. The plane continued to drift dangerously off course, its unsteady movements growing more unpredictable with every passing second. Without pilots actively controlling the aircraft, it wandered like a wounded giant through the sky, swaying left, rising too steeply, then dipping again. The navigation systems beeped warnings that most passengers couldn't understand, but Meyer understood every one of them: altitude deviation, incorrect heading, loss of autopilot stability. And then came the worst news. They were entering restricted airspace, the type of zone where warnings were ruthlessly enforced. Time was running out. The passengers looked out the windows in confusion as fear rippled through the cabin like a rising wave. But Maya felt something else, a cold awareness settling in her chest. She knew what was coming even before the distant rumble echoed through the sky, because when a civilian aircraft drifts where it shouldn't, the military responds fast. Within minutes, 2 F-22 Raptors cut through the clouds like twin blades of silver lightning, roaring into formation beside the helpless commercial airliner. Their engines left trails of heat shimmering behind them, their sharp wings glinting under the sun. One flew so close to the window that passengers on the left side gasped, some yelling, others thinking the end had come. Mothers clutched their children, men stared in stunned silence, and a wave of terror fell over the cabin as the fighter jets tilted their wings, signaling a warning that was impossible to misunderstand. Inside one of those F-22s, the lead pilot reached for his radio with absolute precision. His voice snapped across the airwaves, commanding and sharp. Flight 782, identify yourself immediately. The words crackled through the aircraft speakers, and the flight attendants whipped around, their fear doubling. The situation had officially crossed into military territory. If they didn't respond correctly, the jets could escalate their actions. A flight attendant rushed to Maya with trembling hands, grabbing a headset from the emergency comm box and pressing it into her palms. Her touch lingered for a moment, silently begging Maya to do something, anything to stop what was unfolding outside. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs as she slowly placed the headset over her ears. Her fingers were cold, her throat tight, her breathing rapid. She had talked to pilots before, but never while staring death in the face. She paused, closed her eyes for 1 second, and inhaled deeply. The moment she opened her eyes again, something shifted inside her. Her voice cracked on the first breath, trembling from fear and adrenaline. But on the second breath, something changed, something familiar, something powerful. Her tone became smooth, steady, precise, the way it had during hundreds of simulated crises she had mastered during her cadet training. She pressed the transmit button and spoke clearly. "This is Maya Carter speaking. I have control of communications. Do not fire. We have a medical emergency." The words left her lips with a strength that filled the cabin with stunned silence. Even passengers who didn't understand the situation felt the shift in energy. It was as though a child had suddenly spoken with the authority of a seasoned commander. Inside the cockpit of the lead F-22, the pilot heard the voice and froze. His hand, still gripping the throttle, went rigid. His eyes widened behind his helmet visor. He knew that voice. He had heard it before, not in battle, but in training. Years ago, during a high-pressure simulation when a young voice from the Air Cadet program guided him through a mechanical failure drill, correcting his maneuvers, predicting his next steps, and ultimately helping him land safely during a practice emergency. He had always remembered the strange contrast of that moment. The calm, brilliant confidence of a voice far too young to belong to a certified controller. When the simulation ended, instructors had revealed that the voice guiding him had come from the program's top-ranked young aviation cadet. She had been barely a teenager then, yet sharper and more skilled than many adults. She had been spoken of with awe, referred to as a future star in the aviation world. A prodigy, a rare mind. He remembered her name, he remembered her tone, and now, hearing that same tone in real life, in a real emergency, at 30,000 feet, it sent a jolt of disbelief through him. "Maya Carter," he whispered unintentionally, though the line didn't transmit. His co-pilot glanced at him in confusion. The lead pilot recovered quickly, switching back to professional focus, but his heart continued pounding. The girl speaking from the plane wasn't just a random passenger. She was the Maya Carter, a name that floated through cadet circles like a legend. A girl who had mastered communications, crisis protocols, aeronautical strategy, and emergency response with a precision rare even among adults. And now she was the one speaking to him, holding the fate of a drifting airliner in her hands. Back inside Flight 782, Maya's voice had transformed the atmosphere. Her calmness spread like an anchor, pulling the chaos back to stability. Flight attendants stopped panicking and started listening. Passengers leaned closer, surprised and reassured at the same time. There was something undeniably authoritative about her, the way she spoke, the confidence in her tone, the clarity of her instructions. She wasn't guessing. She knew exactly what she was doing. The F-22 pilot responded, this time with a tone stripped of aggression, replaced by something between respect and urgency. "Maya Carter, confirm the nature of your emergency." Maya didn't hesitate. "Both pilots are unconscious. Cabin crew is unable to stabilize flight systems. We require immediate coordinated guidance." Every word came out steady, controlled, deliberate. The kind of communication that only comes from deep training and deeper bravery, the kind that saves lives. The fighter jets adjusted their formation, flying closer, almost protectively. The lead pilot's voice softened further. "Maya, you're not alone out there. Follow our lead." She felt her eyes sting, not from fear, but from knowing she had stepped into a role she never expected to hold. The fate of the aircraft, the fate of 184 people, rested on her ability to stay calm. She tightened her grip on the headset and nodded to herself. In that moment, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't another forgotten passenger. She wasn't the quiet girl in seat 23A. The moment Maya took control of communications, the situation inside Flight 782 went from terrifying to catastrophic. Flight systems began to malfunction one by one, warning lights flashing across the cockpit screens in chaotic patterns like a storm of red and amber. A shrill altitude alarm pierced through the cabin, rising and falling with urgency as the plane began to dip lower than it should, losing altitude at a dangerous rate. Oxygen masks trembled in their compartments, threatening to deploy. From the cabin behind her, Maya could hear the rising tide of panic as passengers cried, clung to each other, whispered desperate prayers, and stared helplessly at the windows that revealed only endless sky and fast, approaching clouds below. The sound of fear, raw, trembling, human, filled every corner of the aircraft. Some passengers shouted for help, others begged the crew to do something. A few simply closed their eyes, trying to accept whatever fate awaited them. But amid the chaos, Maya's voice remained a steady anchor, cutting cleanly through the noise like a guiding beacon in a storm. F-22 lead, she said with an astonishing calmness that even she didn't recognize as her own. Patch me through to ATC. I can help stabilize the aircraft. Her hands trembled violently at first, but she forced herself to breathe deeply, letting her training override her panic. With a silent nod from one of the flight attendants, she stepped forward toward the cockpit, the place she never imagined she'd enter during a real emergency. As she moved down the narrow aisle, passengers watched her with a mix of confusion and hope. How could this girl, this quiet, small teenager, possibly help? But something in her expression made them trust her anyway, a sharp focus, a quiet strength, a determination born not from confidence but from necessity. She slipped into the co-pilot's seat, the leather still warm from the now unconscious officers, and stared at the massive array of controls, screens, levers, and switches she had studied in countless training modules but never touched in a real cockpit. The alarms blared louder now that she was in the front. Altitude warnings, stall warnings, system errors all layered on top of each other like a horrific mechanical symphony. Her hands shook uncontrollably for a moment, and she pressed them hard against her legs until the trembling eased. She wasn't a pilot, she wasn't certified, she was a cadet. A gifted one, yes, but still just a teenager seated where professionals twice her age normally sat. And yet the weight of the cabin behind her, the lives depending on her, forced her to focus. She strapped herself into the seat, pulled the headset mic closer, and drew in a long, steadying breath. In the sky beside them, the lead F-22 matched their erratic altitude, flying dangerously close to the falling airliner to keep visual contact. The pilot's voice came through the headset, softer this time, almost human beneath the layers of military protocol. Maya, follow my instructions. You can do this. Even through the static, she could hear the disbelief in his tone, not doubt but awe. She responded with a simple copy, her voice steadier than she felt. She placed her hands on the thrust levers, feeling their weight, their resistance, their power. The plane was dipping too fast, the nose slightly down, engines struggling to maintain lift. Ease back on the left throttle, just a touch, the F-22 pilot instructed. She obeyed, watching the engine output climb slightly. Good. Now adjust trim. Nose up, 2 clicks. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence, the muscle memory from every cadet simulator session flooding back at the exact moment she needed it. The trim wheel clicked beneath her fingers, and the nose lifted ever so slightly, not enough to recover, but enough to slow their rate of descent. The alarms continued to wail, but she forced herself to tune them out, listening only to the calm guidance of the fighter pilot and the rhythmic sound of her own breathing. Monitor vertical speed indicator, he said. Tell me what you see. She leaned in, descending at 100 feet per minute, stabilizing slightly now 1000. Good, keep going. Adjust thrust both engines to 82%. She pushed the levers forward gently. The rumble of the engines deepened, vibrating through the cockpit floor and the seat beneath her. The plane responded sluggishly at first, like a tired creature resisting command, but then slowly, almost reluctantly, it began to level out. The descent rate decreased more quickly now, 900, 700, 500 feet per minute. The altitude alarm softened, then disappeared entirely. A different alarm beeped once and went silent, acknowledging partial stabilization. The entire aircraft shuddered one last time as the aerodynamic forces balanced, and then the giant plane stopped falling. The shift was so subtle at first that only someone in the cockpit would notice it: the soft leveling, the quiet hum of engines synchronized, the absence of that terrifying sinking feeling in her chest. But then, seconds later, the passengers felt it too. The screams died down, the oxygen masks stopped rattling. Someone whispered, "We're not dropping anymore." A mother holding her child began to cry, not from fear this time, but from relief. Even the flight attendants paused, died, watching Maya from the cockpit doorway as though witnessing something impossible. For the first time since the pilots collapsed, the plane was steady. Maya stared at the stabilized controls, her breath shaky, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that she had done it. She had stopped the fall, she had bought them time, she had given them a chance to live. And as the F-22 pilot's voice came through the headset once more, filled with pride and something close to reverence, "Maya, you just saved that aircraft." She dared to believe, for the first time, that maybe she truly was capable of more than she ever imagined. Rain hammered against the cockpit windows with a furious intensity as Flight 782 descended through thick storm clouds, each drop hitting the glass like a bullet, blurring the world outside into streaks of gray and silver. The runway finally appeared far below, a thin, glistening strip of hope cutting through the storm, but it looked impossibly small from the shaking cockpit. Emergency vehicles lined both sides, lights flashing red, blue, and white like a beacon for survival. Fire trucks, ambulances, rescue crews, all waiting for a crash they feared was inevitable. But inside the cockpit, Maya refused to let fear control her. Her heart pounded, her breath trembled, but her hands stayed firmly on the controls. Air traffic control filled her headset with urgent instructions: altitude, speed adjustments, crosswind warnings, but it wasn't their voice that kept the aircraft alive. It was Maya's courage, her steady determination, her unshakable will to protect every soul on board. "Easy flare, keep her steady," the F-22 pilot murmured through her headset, his voice calm, grounding her when everything else felt like chaos. The storm pushed violently against the aircraft, wind slamming into the wings with enough force to tip the plane if she made even the smallest mistake. The Boeing shuddered, dipping too low, then rising too high, fighting her every movement as if resisting the idea of being saved. But Maya tightened her grip, jaw clenched, sweat dripping down her temple, as she forced herself not to blink. Every second mattered, every breath mattered, every tiny movement of her fingers meant life or death. As the runway rushed up beneath them, time seemed to slow. The cabin behind her held a tense, breathless silence, hundreds of people clutching hands, whispering prayers, holding on to hope because one brave teenage girl dared to sit in the seat meant for trained pilot. The ground came closer, the lights grew brighter, the storm roared louder. "Flare now," the F-22 pilot instructed. Maya pulled back just slightly on the yoke, her hands steady despite the shaking in her arms, and then impact. The wheels slammed the runway so hard the entire aircraft jolted upward, rattling bones and throwing some passengers forward. Sparks exploded from the landing gear, bright and fiery against the dark, rain-soaked ground. The plane skidded violently, veering left, then right, tires screeching in protest as rubber burned against wet asphalt. Emergency vehicles began racing forward already, preparing for the worst. Maya fought the controls with every ounce of strength she had, pushing against the skid, aligning the aircraft inch by inch, refusing to give up now. Not after everything, not after coming this far. The Boeing shuddered, swerved again, then finally straightened, and then it stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. For a moment no one moved, no one breathed. The only sound was the soft patter of rain on the aircraft skin and the distant hum of rescue vehicles approaching. Maya sat frozen in the cockpit, hands still gripping the controls, chest rising and falling rapidly, as reality crashed into her all at once. She had done it, she had landed the plane, she had saved them. Slowly, from the cabin behind her, a single voice whispered, "We're alive." Another voice followed. Then another, and suddenly a wave of cheers erupted, loud, explosive, overwhelmed with relief. People cried openly, hugged strangers, raised their hands to the ceiling in gratitude. Flight attendants rushed forward and knelt beside Maya, staring at her with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. She looked so small in the massive pilot's seat, but in that moment she was the strongest person on the planet. The headset crackled. The familiar voice came through one last time, filled with pride and awe that he made no attempt to hide. "Maya Carter, you just saved 184 lives." The words echoed in her mind, sinking deep into a place she didn't know she had. She exhaled shakily, tears finally escaping her eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization of what had just happened. Outside, news crews had already begun forming behind barriers. ATC had reported everything. The military had confirmed her role. By the time emergency teams reached the aircraft doors, the world already knew her name, Maya Carter. A quiet girl no one noticed when she boarded Flight 782, a girl who had slipped into her seat unnoticed, headphones on, invisible to the world. A girl who never expected to hold a nation's attention, much less guide a plane through a storm and land it with nothing but courage, instinct, and training far beyond her age. But on that day, everything changed, because the girl no one noticed became the hero the entire world would never forget.